Let's then also not forget the second and possibly even bigger factor that upset the Europeans and the Germans, and that was the use of Iranian drones by Russia in Ukraine.
Yes. Yeah. They were very angry about
So,
that.
in fact, you can say that Iranian high-tech weaponry, if we want to call it that, was used on European soil. And that certainly was then viewed as
Yeah.
Iranian technology threatening Europe.
I mean, yeah, I would be really upset if like European or American military technology was used in the Middle East. I'm sorry.
See, I mean,
I had to make the point.
No, of course, and I agree with you. I mean, this is where the whole discussions get absurd at some point.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. With Saudi Arabia and Iran making peace as part of a deal brokered by China, much has been made about the absence of the U.S. and what it means for U.S. hegemony. But what about the implications for the region? What might it look like in practice? Who are the potential spoilers? And why did this happen now? Also, what does it mean for U.S. empire's greatest global partner, Europe? This is happening at a time when European security and sovereignty is being challenged by the war in Ukraine, as Europe has followed lockstep behind the U.S., often against its own interests. Meanwhile, space to challenge the dangerous status quo in both Europe and the U.S., within politics, academia, and media, is shrinking. Anyone who questions or even just states the obvious is attacked and smeared and branded an apologist for this or that regime. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Adnan Tabatabai, the co-founder and CEO of the Germany-based think tank CARPO, and an Iran analyst who's advised European policymakers. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The rest is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Adnan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rania.
It's so good to have you on, and there's so much to discuss because it's kind of like we live in a bit of a different world. It feels that way, at least, after the last couple of months. So much has happened in such a short amount of time, much of which you've been involved with since even before Saudi and Iran severed diplomatic ties back in 2016. You've been facilitating these track 2 and civil society dialogues between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is quite interesting. So you must have had quite the view of these negotiations as they were being carried out over the last couple of years in Oman and Iraq, and then ultimately, of course, sealed in Beijing, which was, I'm sure you followed, received quite poorly in Washington. There was a great amount of frustration in Washington about this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But, let's start with these new regional openings that we're seeing. There's not just Saudi Arabia and Iran. Also, probably because of this deal, we also see Syria and Saudi Arabia having discussions about a potential détente. Now we see what's happening in Yemen, which is quite remarkable, though that, of course, that was built up over time. There's been a ceasefire in Yemen for a while now. But in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran, why did this happen now?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. I guess we have been seeing this evolving over the past years. What I would say has been an important year was the year 2019, when so many things happened in the Strait of Hormuz, in the neighborhood of Iran and Saudi Arabia, on Iranian soil. So if we just kind of recall what happened between April and September 2019, there were several attacks on oil tankers, on tankers with different goods that they were transporting in this highly important trade route. Iran shot down a US drone in June 2019 over Iranian airspace. We saw the the attacks on Aramco in Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia, that of course Iran denied to have been actively part of, but which in fact we can assume were at least Iran aligned groups. So we saw in fact some kind of escalation in the regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also between Iran and the United Arab Emirates. We then saw in January 2020, very early on in 2020, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis in Iraq, which in fact for many could have been the start of an Iran-US war. So Iraq was once again the theater for Iran-US tensions. And after that, the pandemic kicked in. So why am I mentioning all of this? Is that the level of crisis was increased to an extent that really made regional leaders pause and rethink their approaches of the years before as to whether not talking to each other, allowing escalation to happen, is not maybe starting to be harmful for all sides. And along these years, or along particularly the year 2019 and 2020, a lot of conversations happened with regional stakeholders, and you could see that there is the need to kind of think along new lines and try to find a way to maybe start talking to each other and at least testing the fact that talking to each other might be more beneficial than not talking to each other.
Right. That makes perfect sense. And I mean, I just want to pick up on something you said with regard to Saudi Arabia specifically and the UAE. I mean, these are countries that are supposed to be stable, particularly the UAE, right? It's supposed to be this place that people in the region can go live in that's, free of like war and bombs. And so when the UAE is being hit by the Houthis in Yemen, that's a really, really, really big deal that calls into question the entire, Dubai dream of, come here and do all your business and banking and be free from war. And then, of course, with Saudi Arabia being hit was a huge deal as well. And I also wonder if perhaps for these countries in particular, watching the U.S. withdraw from Afghanistan in 2021 might have led them to think, oh, wow, like it was kind of watching the U.S. abandon this entire government it had basically funded and armed, and that government falling so quickly, and then realizing, hey, if there is a war in this region between Iran and the Gulf states, that war is going to be, we're going to be on the front lines of that. Like America's not going to come in and be the one suffering like we are. So I do wonder if perhaps that played into some of the decision making in terms of, okay, we're losing in Yemen. We're being hit by these groups. We're definitely not winning in terms of this regional rivalry. So perhaps the only option in terms of our own economic prosperity and like future is to sit down and not have this rivalry where we're stuck between, Iran and whatever fight they're having with the US.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite, it makes perfect sense what you say. So, in fact, Iran or the Islamic Republic, in its raison d'etre, in its the way that it exists, has always been since 1979 very anti-US, very anti-West, if you will, or anti-imperialist. And in fact, anti-West and anti-imperialism was always focused on the US. So the anti-US sentiments in Iran had always been in place for the past 44 years. But what happened in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia in 2019 was to realize or to have some sort of skepticism, at least towards the US, because what they beforehand presumed as being the ultimate protection umbrella, if you will, even under President Donald Trump, who was very, very supportive of the Saudis, of the Emiratis in their outreach, in setting up trade relations, etc. Even that US administration, with a very hawkish foreign minister like Mike Pompeo, did not come to the support of the Saudis and basically told them in September after the attacks that this is not the exact words that they used, but basically saying this is your region, your war, your battle, you have to fight it on yourself. And of course, one can assume that Iran was banking on that to happen to pursue the Islamic Republic's ultimate goal of, in fact, ousting the US from the region, which is more or less utopian goal, because never ever will US troops leave for good, but to somehow calibrate it and tune it down a bit. So that experience for the Emiratis and the Saudis was quite something, and certainly led to a change of mind on their behalf.
No, for sure. And also, you know, I do, it's hard not to notice, of course, you know, this was being brokered with various meetings across the region. I mentioned Oman and Iraq specifically. But ultimately, China got involved, and the ultimate deal was sealed in Beijing, which was another big surprise. I mean, I think a lot of people in Washington woke up. I woke up shocked. I wasn't even in Washington at the time, but I woke up pretty stunned. I was like, whoa. And then, of course, there was like this kind of confusion about how to act in Washington. Because on the one hand, you can't be against peace that openly, right? On the other hand, there was extreme anger and frustration, as we even heard from the CIA director, who just a couple weeks ago went to Saudi Arabia to express that frustration, saying, we were blindsided by the fact that this happened, and it happened with China. So I'm just curious if you have any insight into what is the thinking from the Saudis, from the Emiratis, in terms of turning to China. You know, it's not just with this deal. We do see an interesting relationship in the region between these countries that some people might refer to as client states of the US. Obviously, they're great allies of the US, and they're still allies of the US. It's not like they've turned on America. However, there's a major reluctance by these countries to get involved or to back the US in its Cold War on China, which is being escalated. And even in terms of the war on Russia, between the US and Russia, like there's reluctance to be, you know, to participate in sanctions against Russia. In fact, Dubai is basically like, you know, the banking system is created in order for, you know, people to come evade sanctions. A lot of Russian money has been coming into Dubai since the war on Ukraine started. So I'm just curious, what's the calculation there, do you think, with these countries? Don't they fear they're going to upset the Americans, or do they perhaps, you know, see a future world where it's worth it to risk that to be friends with China and Russia?
I mean, in fact, the perception of the world as being only US led is diminishing, of course, but not to an extent that either the Emiratis or the Saudis would turn their back on the US for good. The key word that those who know more than me about the Emiratis and the Saudis and interlocutors from these two countries that I've talked to use the keyword of diversification. And diversification means seeking not only in economic terms to diversify the economy and be less dependent on oil, but to really diversify the relations to now not only just one world power being the US, but to also bring in the Chinese, to also think about India, to think about Japan, South Korea. And this is certainly a path that these countries, speaking of the Emirates and the Saudis, have pursued more proactively in the past years. And for a country like China, security and stability in Iran and Saudi Arabia's neighborhood, or in the Strait of Hormuz, in these trade routes, is existentially important for them. It really is important that the tensions in the region never lead to actual conflict. Some well-informed colleagues were saying that in 2019, when all these attacks happened, that the Chinese actually actively tried to convince the Saudis and the Emiratis not to take the confrontation with Iran too far. And in fact, trying back then already to kind of prevent major escalations from happening. And you know, neither the Emiratis nor the Saudis will ever come to a position like the Iranians to say, let's oust the Americans from here. This will never happen. And I also do not see China being willing to play the same role that the Americans have been playing for the past decades. The presence in the region comes with major pain, with major challenges, with lots of insults, with lots of criticism. So while now it might be a good point in time to not only be an economic partner of the countries in the Gulf region, the Chinese may now really feel inclined to say we also have political weight. How far they are willing to invest this, or how How big this political weight is remains to be seen. But we can, as for now, see that the Iranians and the Saudis were both willing to ascribe this role to China after having done all the homework necessary with the Iraqis and Omanis.
Yeah, and I do want to at one point in this conversation shift a bit to Europe as well, since you are there and you operate from there. But I do also, before I know a few more questions on this particular region, I do want to ask you, what will this deal, do you think, look like in the region in practice if it's successful, right? Because I mean, of course, there's a lot of opportunities for it to be spoiled, and we can talk about that as well. But in terms of economic cooperation, in terms of the security situation, because you do still have a situation in the region where, obviously, like you said, like Iran is an anti-imperialist, anti-West country. It's allied with a lot of these organizations. I live in Lebanon, where we have Hezbollah. And then, of course, it's allied with various groups in Iraq, allied with, this resistance axis, allied with Syria.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think Saudi Arabia is just going to stop caring about Hezbollah in Lebanon, though it would be great if Saudi Arabia, took this as an opportunity to stop intervening or interfering in Lebanon, because it often does do that. But I can't foresee that certain Lebanese dynamics would necessarily change that much. Maybe I'm wrong. But what are the positives of this deal? What does it actually mean for the region if this deal is followed through?
Look, I think what really matters most, in very, very simple terms, is that the rivalry and competition that will always continue between these two major powers of the region, geographically, Iran and Saudi Arabia have to be in competition with each other. So that will probably not change. But the major change now, and the one thing that makes me at least hopeful, is that diplomatic ties are restored so that talks can happen on a regular basis between different peoples on different ranks, in different ranks of the diplomatic, let's say, on different diplomatic levels. Let's put it this way. So there is continuous conversation which can prevent rivalry and competition from turning into actual conflict.
Right.
And there are, in fact, three stages, maybe at least two, maybe three stages where we can foresee Iran-Saudi relations. Look at a very, very distant stage, and that is the relations between Germany and France, for example. Two big countries in Europe, similar size of the territory. Obviously, Germany is the bigger country in terms of population. These two have, on the basis of the Élysée contract, are actual friends in the region where they could be rivals. And of course, at times there is a bit of political rivalry here and there, but it never ever even reaches the point of tensions. So that is a bit utopian to think of Iran and Saudi in that respect. But what I foresee as a reachable goal is the relations between Iran and Turkey, where you have contexts like Syria or Iraq, the Nagorno-Karabakh situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, to some extent even Afghanistan, when the Turks were very active in trying to run Kabul airport. So there is a lot where Iran and Turkey are on the completely different sides of interests. And there has also been some sort of political tension, but we haven't seen any even danger of actual conflict. And the reason for that is that the trade relations, family relations between Iranians and Turks, the visa-free travel going back and forth between these two countries, and constant political exchange, and of course trade relations, have led to a situation in which it seems as if this relationship, which could always be defined by rivalry and competition, seems to be somewhat immunized from actual conflict. Maybe one day between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that would also be thinkable. The third scenario I could think of, look at Iran-Azerbaijan relations, for example. We see a lot of tensions right now, and there is a lot that is in fact brewing up between these two countries. Things have happened in the past months, assassinations happening in the Azerbaijani embassy in Tehran, and other things in the border areas. But there is constant diplomatic contact between these two, and you can actively see how, at least on the Iranian side, because that's what I follow most, I'm a bit more ignorant on how the Azerbaijani side is putting this, but at least on the Iranian side, there is always the attempt to make sure that tensions do not turn into dangerous conflict.
Right.
So this in itself can be a big win for the region if Iran and Saudi Arabia make sure that their rivalry and competition never leads to on the ground battles. But for that to happen, of course, a lot of relations have to be established, trade relations, people to people relations beyond the Hajj pilgrimage or the pilgrimage of Shia Saudis traveling to Iran. That has been happening in the past, but it would have to go beyond that.
This is basically the world of mediation, right? There has to be something to lose if there is a conflict. And if there's something to lose, then people are less likely to
Yeah, and I mean,
fight each
you
other.
you you also need. I mean, this is like negative incentives. If you do something because you're concerned about something bad happening, but there can also be positive incentives. So that is, if we start working together, this can help your economy, my
Right.
economy. The level of knowledge between within my population, your population. So creating win-win scenarios could, of course, be something that incentivizes both.
So I just really quickly want to show this one tweet because it's definitely worth it. This happened yesterday, although when this airs, it'll probably have been a few days ago. And this speaks to, I think, the issue of spoilers. So this is a tweet from, as you can see, the son of the former Shah of Iran, saying, "I'm traveling to Israel to deliver a message of friendship from the Iranian people, engage Israeli water experts on ways to address the regime's abuse of Iran's natural resources, and pay respects to the victims of the Holocaust. I want the people of Israel to know that the Islamic Republic does not represent the Iranian people. The ancient bond between our people can be rekindled for the benefit of both nations. I'm going to Israel to play my role in building toward that brighter future." This is obviously kind of hilarious because this is the son of a former dictator of Iran, who's claiming that the evil Iranian regime does not represent the Iranian people, but apparently he does. I'm pretty sure he lives in California and no one's ever voted for him. But the reason I even bring this up, other than the fact that it's a little bit funny, is just to ask about spoilers. Not that I think that he has the capacity to spoil this deal. I mean, he's, I think, ultimately not a very important figure whatsoever. Um, he's just kind of like this person that a lot of people in the Americans care about, as being the potential future ruler of the Iran they want to see. But more just, I do think it's interesting that he's traveling to Israel, rather than perhaps Saudi Arabia. Maybe at some point he would have traveled to Saudi Arabia and tried to make relations there. But it just speaks to, when we think about people who are against this deal, I would think of the Americans, right? The American officials in DC who expressed frustration for obvious reasons. I mean, obviously, a more peaceful region, that lessens the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia is not good for the US if the US still seeks to like crush Iran, which, Iran is an adversary that in every single Pentagon, every single white paper from the Pentagon, every single testimony from like a CENTCOM leader, you hear them talk about Iran and how it, challenges US interests, and that's really bad. But also we have the Israelis, right, which are still close allies of the US. I would imagine they'd be against this deal, especially because the Israelis were really banking on some kind of normalization with the Saudis. And it's kind of the opposite. We're seeing Saudi Arabia normalizing with like Iran and the Houthis in Yemen, more than any potential to normalize with Israel at this point. And of course, there are still, like you mentioned, America's still very much present in the region. There's lots of opportunities for spoiling. So all that's to say, what are the potential spoilers that we should be looking out for when it comes to this deal?
Certainly, a deal of, or let's say a political rapprochement or a process towards a rapprochement of this importance has its spoilers, and there are spoilers certainly within the two countries. I would, at this point, at least say, in both countries, these spoilers are relatively sidelined right now for this process, and mainly with regards to Iran, I can say with more confidence, because I know more about Iran, that the way that this whole process was brought about was led by the security apparatus of the country. It was brought forward by the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, which is in fact the one political entity that creates factional and institutional consensus on relevant security matters. So once these folks, if you will, these officials have set the stage. The diplomats are now taking over. So the fundament on which the diplomatic process that is happening as we speak is quite solid, because it was security officials from both countries who have paved the way for it. So they have more or less created a solid ground for this. Of course, there are geopolitical actors that aren't too happy about the prospects of this actually working. It's at this stage too early to say whether the US is really happy or unhappy about it. I would assume, I mean, the sense that I get from stakeholders, both in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, is, as I mentioned earlier, they will never turn their back against the US and never abandon the US. But even this more diversified approach of the Emiratis and the Saudis in seeking geopolitical trade relations or security protection is something the US may not like. But here again, I mean, you know that better than I do because you watch the DC scene more than I do. There will be different viewpoints, and my sense has always been that the Biden administration, regardless of how well they have done in the past months and roughly 2 years, to me has always been an administration that wants to see stability in the region, and that wouldn't object a balanced approach to war, or at least a balanced relations in the neighborhood of Iran and Saudi Arabia. With regards to Israel, of course, I mean, there was this idea, and the idea still persists, of the Abraham Accords, and the main goal was to in fact have Saudi Arabia officially join the accords. We all know that the Saudis have been much more reluctant compared to the Emiratis and the Bahrainis. I have heard that the Abraham Accords have been, in fact, doing to the GCC what the rift with Qatar had done to the GCC, as the one political issue where divisions come up between countries of the GCC. While I think that is to be taken seriously, that divisions can occur, I at the same time think that you will always have major geopolitical questions where there cannot be a unified position because of different varying interests. So I think for now, probably trying to undo this rapprochement process would probably come from a very hawkish side of the US spectrum.
Yeah.
I think the Emiratis and the Saudis will have to show the Israelis to what extent they will distance themselves from what the Abraham Accords should bring, or on the Saudi side, normalize the process of normalization. But I see it not as a contradiction from neither the Emirates nor Saudi Arabia, because I think it's not a contradiction to seek to balance this out, to try and get as close as possible to Israel, while at the same time seeking rapprochement with Iran. I think they're trying to play both sides here.
It's also really interesting what you said about Iran, because I think a lot of people in the mainstream, I doubt people who watch my show would think this, but a lot of people in the mainstream think Iran is just this like crazy state that makes these crazy decisions and just wants absolute war all the time. When in fact, Iran is in quite a vulnerable position economically, obviously because of sanctions. And actually thinks quite, those who are in charge, at least of the security situation, do often think quite pragmatically when it comes to this sort of thing. And obviously it's good for Iran to lessen tensions with Saudi Arabia, especially after the last 5 or 6 years that were pretty terrible for security across the region, with the rise of ISIS, which was so threatening for Iran. And Iran did play a huge role in defeating ISIS. No matter how much people in DC want to deny that. But anyways, it's just very interesting. You mentioned that the security establishment was largely behind like building the foundation for this deal.
No, I mean, look, I would really say, if I compare my own thinking, like let's say 10, 15 years ago, or maybe even more, I always thought that the military guys on all sides are the bad guys, so to speak, those who have a zeal and hunger for war, which is obviously nonsense, because their task is to protect their respective country.
Right.
Unlike politicians, they cannot just say something because they believe that their constituents may like it or not. They will have to make realistic assessments, and they will lose their jobs if they fail to do so. So if I learned something in the past years of a lot of field research in the region on different sides with different interlocutors. Once the actual security and strategy towards securing the national territorial integrity is at stake, ideology really loses ground. And that is true for almost all countries that I had the privilege of visiting and talking to. So I think here in the end, when the threat perception reaches a point where political talking points simply do not help, we really hear a lot of pragmatism on all sides, mainly when the microphones are switched off or when there's no cameras in the room, so that there is no posturing. And that posturing has always been a problem in hearing a lot of nonsensical stuff coming from all these countries.
That's a really good point. I do want to shift to where you're actually based, which is I want to talk about the European context and actually what this means for Europe. Not to center Europe, but I do wonder, how is this deal being perceived in Europe? How is it being covered in Germany? You're in Germany, which is like the epicenter of Europe, the leader of Europe. How is it being portrayed there? Is it being portrayed in a positive light? Is it being discussed at all? And the reason I ask that is, well, there's a couple things. There's a couple points I want to touch on here. And one is, the rivalries and the violence in the Middle East has actually affected Europe way more than the US on a number of levels. I mean, Europe has been subject to so much blowback from US wars in the Middle East. And I don't want to take, responsibility away from Europe. Many European countries have been involved in participating or assisting the US in these various wars, whether we're talking about, Iraq or Syria or Libya. I mean, Libya was like a NATO a NATO intervention, but all of these various acts of war ended up creating these massive waves of refugees that, ultimately, where do they go? They go to Europe. And I think in many ways you could argue that the waves of refugees that came to Europe ultimately changed the politics of Europe and pushed it more to the right in many countries and empowered many of the various right-wing parties, whether we're talking about Germany or France or, Poland or Hungary. But moreover, you had these various, people going to join the fight in Syria or Iraq to be a part of ISIS or other, similar groups, and then coming back to Europe and carrying out attacks. There was a number of years where that happened. So that's all to say, I would guess, I don't know, I would guess that there would be excitement for, enthusiasm for a peace deal like this, because I think that for Europe, it's actually a good thing. But so all that said, what does it mean for Europe? How is it being covered there? How do politicians in a place like Germany feel about Iran and Saudi Arabia making peace?
There is, let's start with the policy scene. There is a lot of interest in that. There is a lot of interest in knowing, is this a real deal, or is this basically just for show? But really, we have to say that the capacities to deal with the Iran-Saudi rapprochement process are actually not there. Europe is fully occupied with looking at the war on Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.